If you're interested in AI and data centers, then you should be interested in how we're going to power the AI economy. Welcome to On Energy, presented by NRG. Joining me today is Travis Culillo. He is our VP of Regulatory Affairs, and Robert Ott, VP of Origination. He also leads what we call our large load team that's working with the hyperscaler and data center guys. And both of these gentlemen have deep background in the energy industry. Uh, and today's conversation is really to talk about where we are with the stakeholders. And from the first episode, one of the outcomes is I wonder about stakeholder alignment and whether we have it and what's it going to take to get that. So we're going to if we can throw up the first exhibit that kind of outlines broadly who are the stakeholders. So, obviously we have existing grid consumers, all the implications of tightening supply and demand on price and reliability are going to come into play. So you've got, those guys who have a large voice in how this thing is going to happen over time. Of course, you've got the power providers or the power industry and all of our stakeholders that are captured in that group that are trying to figure out, how to not only build power plants, but build all the transmission and distribution and the cost associated with making that happen. You got the big tech guys that are looking for as much power as they could possibly get, as soon as they can possibly get it. These companies are, the world's largest companies. They're spending trillions of dollars across the globe to make the AI reality happen. And then finally, probably most importantly, I call it team government. So this is everything from the federal guys to your state, politicians, regulators, even to some degree, the independent system operators who kind of take their marching orders from those. So we're going to try to dig in a little bit today just to frame up who are all the players. And certainly we're not going to cover it. I think there'll be additional episodes where we're able to go into each one of these and kind of talk about who they are and what they're looking for. And most importantly, how do you align the risk tolerances associated with their business models and the outcomes of making this happen. So Travis, I kind of want to open this up to you and Robert first and just talk about the current state of alignment and how important is alignment. Am I just off base there with the idea that we really don't have a federal energy policy in the states, in a way that can influence and give, some kind of reassurance to all these stakeholders that we can find a solution to make this happen?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, Scott. And your premise is correct. I don't think we do have a lot of alignment, and it's something we badly need. Some places are better than others. I think Texas is a good example where more alignment exists because the state government, regulates sort of proactively more things. But in those parts of the country where you have a division of responsibilities on the power grid between the American federal government, the state governments and local governments, there's a lot of balkanization. And even if we're referring to team government, you have a division of responsibilities and conflicting interests that really make a lot of this difficult. So, we've heard a lot about sort of national American ambitions for American energy dominance, powering the AI revolution. That comes up against things like trade barriers and tariffs, which, increase the costs of supply. So even within that umbrella, there's some tension. And it's also a fact that, unlike a lot of other industries, the federal government really has not occupied this regulatory space. It leaves a lot of decisions about the power sector up to state governments and their public utility commissions. And those state governments are less concerned with the national interest than they are with, their ratepayer concerns, more parochial local interests. And then, of course, you get to local government, which tends to be the one that controls siting determinations for local facilities. And as you can expect, local land use issues predominate there. And those interests end up taking premier billing over affordability or over the national interest in AI dominance. So a lot of conflicting objectives within the various subunits of government.
Yeah, I want to throw up one more slide or exhibit, and this is the top producing countries, and going back to 1985, and it just shows you uh, how much capacity China has. Now, obviously, China has 1.4 billion people, but from about 2000 on, they're on an exponential growth curve of electrifying their economy. So they have the muscle memory, and this is something that Robert's talked about quite a bit in the industry in the US, and we talked about it in the first episode. We haven't built a lot of new generation, and our actual consumption is flat to declining across North America.
We
And
haven't
it,
built a whole lot of new gas fired gener. We built a lot of intermittent generation, but yeah,
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 but a lot relative. I think China added 377
sure,
gigs of renewables in 2024.
yep,
We probably added 30 or 40 or something. That's energized. Like they are, 10xing what we are. So in total terawatt hours, they're over 10,000. We're at about 4,200. And, nameplate capacity, they have 3.4 terawatts and we have 1.2. And to your point, we just have not, we've had flat loads for the last 20 years. ERCOT's seen some load growth, and we've had more activity there. But in general, most of North America has been flat for 20 years. Probably some of that is the offshoring of industries, it's energy efficiency, things like that. But we're at this inflection point being driven by the need for, AI data centers and the exponential amount of capacity that at least they're reporting and trying to get online. So I think the AI arms race is real, not only in the large language model space, but who's going to control it and who has the energy to make it happen. And that's another kind of big picture point is I think electricity is the long pole in the tent.
yeah,
And so throughout this series of podcasts, we're really going to try to dig into, the large language models are happening on an exponential growth curve. Chips, super chips, they're breaking Moore's law with their capacity and capability. Data centers are being thrown up left and right. Announcements of data centers are happening, every day. So it is very real. The technology is real, the capability. But how does the power industry in North America, and more specifically in the U.S., keep up with this kind of demand growth? And then you've got to, juxtapose that to what does it mean to existing grid consumers? Are they going to subsidize this? Are they going to pay a higher cost and potentially have lower reliability if we can't, keep the supply and demand in check?
I guess one policy question I would have for Travis would be around, we have these tremendous load forecasts, and we think some portion of those load forecasts are real. It's not a mirage. But Travis, what are your thoughts on any kind of federal policy around or state policy, grid operator policy around queue reform, so that we can really kind of get at the heart? I mean, these load forecasts and the queues are great. They're very fair and open and democratic, but you get a lot of participants in these queues. It's a low hurdle to jump into a queue, and it just kind of creates a lot of noise, and that's what markets need to sort through. But I don't know, Travis, thoughts on any kind of queue reform?
Yeah, on both the load side and the generator side, we have what are called interconnection queues that still kind of operate under like gold rush rules. And anyone can stake a claim in a gold rush, right? Whether you have the right equipment, the know-how, the right location and technology to develop that claim is a completely separate matter. And so it's probably time in both of those sides that we move from something like first in time, first in right gold rush rules to something where you have to prove up the claim more quickly, and actually, have the know-how, be able to bring generation online with kind of a financial demonstration or a demonstration that you've secured equipment. And then on the load side, similarly, there should be some expectation that these large customers, very well capitalized customers, are able to make some kind of forward deposit or financial security. And you see states around the country, utilities developing protocols to try to make that happen. There's a balance that needs to be struck to make sure you're not actually dismissing projects that are viable with too many onerous preconditions. But they're getting there, and I think there's a gradual realization that we're at an era of real scarcity around available grid capacity to be able to interconnect, that policies that try to promote the highest and best use of that grid are actually nowadays coming to the fore, because those gold rush rules just are not working nowadays in the capacity constrained environment.
Right. And they also have a very different risk tolerance, right? So if you're a rate regulated utility and you're building transmission distribution lines, you want regulators to give you a guaranteed return on that. And by the way, transmission costs, distribution costs over the past 10 years have gone up exponentially already without really this being impactful. So we're already seeing higher cost in that segment of, a consumer's bill. But just to back up, Travis, can you talk a little bit about the Trump administration? I know they've had some executive orders, but they've also created a lot of confusion around tariffs, tax incentives for renewables, batteries, all, kind of key elements of what we've had for the past 20 years of being a part of, the grid system. Companies that are in that space are pausing projects potentially, and it's just another level. So, are you hearing anything from the Trump administration about how they can alleviate some of the risk associated with these different stakeholders, as well as clearing the regulatory types of impediments that might slow down more development?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the top line messaging of the Trump administration has been very supportive of this kind of generation development. And you're seeing, you know, you've seen a lot of the environmental regulation that would have led to a lot of uncertainty in terms of investment in new gas-fired generation being pulled back. You hear a lot of supportive things being said about, clean, firm technologies from the administration. There's open questions about the willingness of, the Trump Department of Energy to kind of open its checkbook and underwrite some of these technologies. There's obviously going to be a constriction on that relative to what there was in the past. You also see tax subsidies that have been the bread and butter of some of the renewable industries, really under significant threat of revision, in Congress, and some of that's been candidly overdue. But there's this kind of war between, wanting more activity on the supply side and wanting to use the power of the government to unlock that supply side activity, and then restraints on supply supportive policies, that have really got that done. And every administration kind of deals with this, but the Trump administration has more headline policies that sometimes seem to openly conflict with one another than many administrations, because it's just trying to do a lot of things at once, I think.
Yeah, and I feel like it's an all the. I mean, we have to attack it with an all the above kind of approach, from fossil fuels to nuclear to renewables to batteries at scale, and probably scales that we haven't even attempted so far. But in general, is executive orders enough to make that happen, or do we need legislation of a Manhattan Project type of initiative that will have to work its way through Congress? Of course, there are a lot of lawsuits about every executive order that comes out, and I'm sure the environmental community wants the tax incentives to stay in place, but also more review of the carbon footprint being left potentially by this. So there's just a lot of conflict, right, with the stakeholders just around getting a policy that'll work. And you mentioned Texas earlier. It doesn't have the FERC oversight piece. That's a nuance, and I'm sure we'll get into that in a future episode. They did pass a piece of legislation called SB6, and we'll dig into it. But how much of this do you think Trump can do through executive order to kind of accelerate some of the generation production capabilities?
Yeah, a little bit through executive order for sure. I think his use of executive orders can cause federal regulators to take a very hard-nosed view of the reliability of capacity on the grid in a way that promotes investments in reliable capacity. They've taken action to retain generation that would have otherwise retired, kind of an approach associated with industrial policy rather than market-based policy, which people can disagree about. But fundamentally, Scott, I mean, the federal government, the federal law really leaves decisions in this industry up to individual states. Actually, there's a fascinating federal law in the book that it's worth viewers knowing about because it's just indicative of how little, in a way, the federal government has decided to exercise its prerogatives. And that law simply says, hey, whenever the federal government is buying power for its own operations, it is subject to local state public utility commission regulatory decisions.
Yeah.
So
So
you're literally talking about like the U.S. Army being subject to entities like, the Alabama Public Service Commission and the Alabama power monopoly that exists in
wow.
that state for their procurement. And so, frankly, I mean, this is just Travis talking, but I mean, if you really wanted to supercharge this industry, you probably wouldn't have local gatekeeping institutions be the sole funnel through which capital has to flow to support electric power investments. And that's still the case in a majority of states. Happily, not in states that we operate in. But again, our permission to operate is almost contingent on state level decisions, sadly, and not
Right.
a federal energy dominance agenda, which
Yeah.
is not
Which
just
kind
plays
of,
at monopolies.
that clearly points out when you have China with kind of a central controlled economy and politics, building power plants, I would assume is, a much more facilitated, central planning exercise than federal policy, red state, blue state. And Robert, you're seeing that with, the projects you're working on, depending on the state you're in, much different rules around interconnects or even building
The
new
type of
power
generation
plants.
you can build. Yes.
Right.
Yep.
And so can you talk a little bit about, at a high level, I know you're
Sure.
into some deal details, but at a high level, what those guys really want, and are their expectations? Do their expectations exceed what our the power industry's capabilities are?
Sure. Yeah, we're working with a range of data center market participants. We have a number of sites within our portfolio, some smaller sites, retired power plant sites to active, very large sites and other greenfield sites. And across that our portfolio of sites, we're working with a range of different developers, from small data center developers, large data center developers, and hyperscalers. And I think the one thing that is consistent across all those different developers, I mean, there's a real focus on as we've talked about a lot, Scott, just speed to market. They want power, in 2027, 2028, maybe
Yeah,
29. They don't want to even talk about 2030. So speed to power is important. Location. They're not indifferent. Some are good with, Dallas or ERCOT. Others want to focus on PJM. Location matters. Cost matters, obviously, to a certain extent, but speed to power is I think more important than cost. And then finally, I think for some of them, not all, but for some of them, they want a pathway to a decarbonization story, and so it's got to be kind of a real story and a real pathway, and so there's a number of different objectives. But the key thing is, you can't, you got to have a site that's ready to go. You can't, they're swimming in
yeah.
opportunity.
Talk about like the foundational pieces: fiber, water, power,
Yeah, you
all
need
that kind.
fiber, water, the correct air permitting. It's got to be in the right market. I mean, now there's with SB6, there's new requirements around, potential, low, curtailments or the use of backup gen. So there's there's a number of different drivers that really kind of impact their decisions around it. But you got to have a site that's ready to go where you've got the equipment, you've got the interconnection with the utility. Because like I said, they're swimming in sites, and it's not like studying it's not like looking at a house on Zillow, right? I mean, looking at a site is complicated. There's a lot of nuances. It's probably certainly a multi-week, maybe a multi-month process. And if you take a site to market and it's not ready to go, then how many times are you going to be able to do that with a certain
Right.
potential customer? And so we have to have things buttoned down. And fortunately, like Scott, we've talked about muscle memory. The industry, has kind of lost a lot of muscle memory in terms of this kind of load growth. The industry pivoted to renewable development, to small, short duration battery development. But fortunately, we kept the muscle,
Yeah.
in terms of our development team, and we kept developing new sites,
Right.
and we've got the 1.5 gigawatts of new generation coming online. So fortunately, we had the foresight to keep developing that muscle, and we've got a team and a strategy for those sites where it's suitable. Not all sites, not all of our sites are suitable for new generation, but we have a bring your own generation kind of a philosophy, and it's totally consistent, with SB6, and it's totally consistent with, I think, where, ever since the Talon Amazon deal, the first Talon Amazon deal that was behind the meter, which was great. I mean, it's great that Talon got attempted to do that deal, but I think we all kind of recognized that a gigawatt behind existing capacity, that's political. And so there's going to be,
Yeah.
some issues there. And, love to hear kind of Travis's kind of, if he could go back in time.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
I,
Travis, weigh in before you do it. A
Yep.
gigawatt is equivalent of 800,000 homes, roughly.
Yeah.
So if you take a gig off the grid, that's a lot of electricity that powers homes. That's going to influence what's happening to those existing grid customers. The other thing I wanted to point out is these aren't just large load in the context of history. Data centers used to be 20, 30 megawatts. Then we got the hyperscaler getting into 50 to 100. They're talking about 1 to 1.5 at a lot of these sites, gigs.
Yeah.
So it's just a massive amount of electricity, and it's around the clock.
That's
So it's
right, Scott. And I think back then, when it was 50 megawatts all the way up to maybe 200 megawatts, is largely a real estate game at that
right,
point. And
right.
then at some point in the last couple of years, it changed from a real estate game. I mean, still, I mean, real estate is a big part of it, but it's turned into a power first game. And so there's, the data center folks are coming our way, we're coming their way, and we're all having to try and get on the same page and kind of speak the same language and speak it fluently, because I mean this isn't going to happen if we're talking past one another. But yeah, I'd love to hear kind of Travis's thoughts on kind of that, these large kind of behind the
yeah.
meter at existing gen.
Yeah, and I think there's a big difference, and it needs to be clarified about using sort of legacy industrial brownfield sites and building something new and additive there, which is very consonant with kind of the Trump administration's philosophy of onshoring or adding new industries to places that have candidly been kind of deindustrialized over time, versus taking the kind of existing remaining capacity on the grid and drinking that milkshake and hoovering it up. The latter is bound to be controversial because we are already operating in a very tight market. This would be a totally different conversation, right? If we were having it, 10 or 15 years ago, when we still had a lot of spare capacity on the grid. But a lot of that has been chewed through and retired.
Well,
And
and we've been building like the renewables, we've built whatever, 47, 48 gigawatts of renewables in ERCOT since 2020, about 10 gigawatts of short-term batteries, and just like 3 gigawatts of dispatchable gen since
yeah,
2020.
that's right.
So
And
the market had pivoted to, intermittent resources, and
completely.
it just creates this plot twist where you
It
have
does.
now
So
this,
so you have this great confluence of
yes,
factors where people are suddenly realizing that you've retired a lot of dispatchable generation, you've added a lot of intermittence, the reliability implications of which have not become particularly obvious just until the last few years, as you've started taking really a hard-nosed view, and I won't drop any jargon here, but of how the capacity contributions of those resources are measured. And then you layer that on top of, wow, holy cow, suddenly demand is poised to grow again. And it really almost doesn't matter what market you're in.
Yeah.
You see conditions being tight. And I completely understand in that context why regulators and policymakers would be alarmed about both the affordability and reliability implications of big tech kind of hoovering up available supply. So that's kind of the core policy question, in addition to who pays for the grid and how quickly can people get online. And I'm very glad to be on the side of a team who's trying to develop new stuff to serve these new customers, because you know the existing grid does have some slack capacity, particularly say for flexible demand, but it doesn't have a lot of spare capacity for 24/7 demands like these are mostly. So new stuff needs to come online in order to accommodate this new type of customer.
Yeah, and I would say, Scott, I would just add that, I think what we're seeing amongst, our data center, development partners and others in the market, the hyperscalers, along with all the other kind of attributes that we were just talking about regarding the site. I think they're also looking for, partners like us that can really orchestrate, the gas, the power, the retail, the wholesale, the regulatory, provide them, like I said, a pathway on renewables or, some other kind of decarbonization pathway. But, they want, I think they recognize, going behind the meter for existing has gotten super challenging. They need to find power. They need to find power in markets that make sense for them from a data center perspective. And they need somebody like NRG that can really provide the full suite, of services and just give them a simple kind of long-term and large retail agreement.
Yeah. And everything is more expensive. We're all competing for the same resources. The data centers, are going up everywhere, and there's labor and materials and everything else associated with, the economy there. So I think, there's no way that this can't have some kind of inflationary factor on building new power plants. And I'm sure we're going to do an episode on what it takes to build a new power plant and get, deeper into that. But in general, big tech wants power. They want it now. I think their preference is they'd rather be served by the grid principally than, something else. But there's a lot of strategies that are going on with the on-site generation or behind the meter. Again, that'll be a great topic for another conversation, because a lot of complications with that. And you can see just by this limited conversation we've had so far, between what government wants to do and needs to do to keep in the arms race, to keep economic prosperity through, AI efficiency and things like that, and deal with the existing grid consumers, because those folks vote. And if they're paying higher prices and have lower reliability, that's a political problem. It becomes a regulatory problem. So you can get into this do loop of, competing objectives and risk tolerances that don't set up, which leads me into, I want to kind of talk about team power. So this is basically everybody that is involved with powering the existing grid, as well as making these data centers work. And with that, you have a lot of different business models. We'll talk about that later. But in general, trying to align the risk tolerances there and capabilities seems to be another complete problem with state level regulations. The financial risk tolerances of a rate regulated utility versus a gentailer like us, and the kind of decisions we would make versus them. But it looks like everybody in the power segment wants a guarantee. They want to be guaranteed that they're going to make their money back.
Check out part 2 as we continue to explore the power players shaping the future of AI.